It is an honor to be asked to be a part of the lectureship again this year, an honor just to attend the lectureship. I told Guyton I didn't have to be invited to speak. Before we attended, we'll support this whether we're speakers or not. So it's an honor to be able to sit and listen to these wonderful lectures, and then an honor also to try to address a particular topic on this lectureship. We are going to be discussing a history of Judaism, 2nd to the 4th centuries A.D., and your lectureship concerns history and religious history in particular, and some folks aren't that much into history, as has already been observed and pointed out. I told the folks back in Verona that I would be out of pocket this past Sunday, yesterday, to be attending a lectureship down in Florida and would be speaking Monday morning on this lectureship, and somebody asked me what the theme of the lectureship was, and I said it's a sort of an overview of religious history from 33 AD to 1500 or thereabouts. And somebody yawned, and then they asked me what my topic would be, and I said, well, I'm going to be talking about the history of Judaism, 2nd to the 4th centuries AD, and they rolled their eyes. Some of those folks rolled their eyes at me. And Guyton said I was influential in that area. I'm not going to be preaching this sermon back home at Verona, needless to say. What I ought to do is take that lectureship book next Sunday and just start a series and start with Guyton's lesson and preach the whole book. That'd show them, wouldn't it? That'd show them. But I'll refrain from that. They're good folks in Verona. We've been there 26 years, and to keep me that long, they've got to be good folks, and they've been really nice to us, and may not appreciate religious history as much maybe as some of us do, but they're good folks, and we enjoy our work there. We are all historians, aren't we? We're all interested in history. You've got photo albums, and you may have those digitally stored, but whenever we take trips down memory lane while we're looking at history, our history may not make the textbooks. None of us probably will ever be famous. Hopefully will not be infamous, but our history is important to us. So we're all historians, and we're all interested, obviously, in history, even if it's just a slice of our own history, people and places and things that are important to us. And so a study, as Brother Guyton pointed out Sunday morning, a study of history, secular or religious, is something that is beneficial, and he noted some of the benefits of that. In being assigned this topic, that presented to me a number of challenges, and I want to talk about some of those before we get into the lesson itself, into the bulk of our study. And one challenge that I was confronted with up front was, how do you pronounce this word, Judaism? Is it Judaism? Is it Judaism? Is it Judaism? Well, is it I love my Aunt Dorothy or I love my Aunt Dorothy? When I mail a letter, do I mail it in an envelope or in an envelope? Do I live in the state of Mississippi or is it Mississippi? I was reared near Sharon, Tennessee, or is it Sharon, Tennessee? Is it tomato or tomato? Is it Tanya or Tanya? Does it matter? My aunt doesn't care whether I say aunt or aunt as long as I love her. The fellow who gets my letter could care less if I send it in an envelope or envelope. And as far as living in Mississippi is concerned, that's the least of our worries, how you pronounce the name of our state. If you travel to Sharon, Tennessee, half the population there of 1,000 will say it's pronounced Sharon. The other half will say Sharon. And however you say tomato or tomato, they taste good, however you slice them and however you pronounce them. Tanya will answer to Tanya or Tanya. Either one will work. She prefers Tanya. I get that straight. It's Tanya Tucker, so that's how I keep straight Tanya Cox, if you get what I'm saying there. But so the point I'm making is, some words, it doesn't matter how you pronounce it. It's a win-win situation. But what about this Judaism? If I happen to study with a Jewish friend, I probably up front would ask him, how do you pronounce the name of your religion, and does it really matter? In researching this topic, I discovered a lot of things. One thing was that there are some Jews, not all, but some Jews are offended at how I've said Judaism all my life. Judaism, Judaism, Judaism. They say we did not descend from Judy. There is no woman named Judy in our background, so don't say Judaism. You can say Judaism. You can say Jew, emphasis on Judaism, but some of them don't like our pronouncing Judaism. Well, old habits are hard to break. And I butcher the language anyway, so I'm going to do the best I can. And again, it's not a salvation issue as we understand, so I'll probably flip-flop back through the course of this lecture, and you'll know what I'm saying when I talk about Judaism, Judaism, or Judaism. Either one will work. There are some words we're going to be looking at in the course of our study, and I didn't have a clue how to pronounce them, and I probably still don't. I looked online. It's amazing what you can look up online, and you can look up how to pronounce words in whatever language. And I looked up some of these words as to how Jews actually pronounce these words, and found out that they don't even pronounce some of these words the same. So hopefully we're going to be safe however we say some of these words, and you understand that. Now, a second challenge in getting ready for this lecture is, where am I going to find information about Judaism, 2nd to the 4th centuries A.D.? And this sounds up front just blasphemous, but you can forget about the Bible. There is nothing in the Word of God from Genesis to Revelation about Judaism from the 2nd to the 4th centuries A.D. unless I overlook something. Now, there's all sorts of information, obviously, about Judaism in the 1st century and the background of that, but not in our particular time frame. We're going to make application, Lord willing, at the end of our study from the Bible as to what we've said. So I had to turn, as these other speakers have had to turn, to secular sources to come up with this information. This is, for me, new material. I am in an uncharted territory in studies that I've engaged in before. So where am I going to find anything about this subject in this time frame? I thought there had to be a book somewhere, Judaism for Dummies, or for complete idiots in my case, I guess. There had to be some kind of book like that, but I didn't find that. I have a son, thankfully, who's a graduate student at Mississippi State, and he could access any book there, or actually any book across the country through the interlibrary loan, and so he saved the day as far as my research was concerned in finding references and so forth. One thing I found out is, of course, that we're talking about history from secular historians, and the Jews will put one slant on history, and their opponents will put another slant on history, and we do the very same thing today, obviously. So historians don't always agree, and you'll find in the course of this lecture and probably other lectures that there are points of controversy. I didn't live back then. You didn't live back then. All we have to go on is what they have said, and so we'll do the best we can with that. Brother Jeff last night did a wonderful job, as all the speakers have done. He did a great job talking about Josephus. And for the most part, Josephus was a reliable historian about Judaism there in the 1st century. But now when we come to the 2nd century, well, forget about him. He's long gone. He doesn't exist. Think about Josephus. I think about what Jeff was talking about last night and the research he did on Josephus, something that sort of steams me today. When I was getting ready to go to preaching school, in the past, growing up, I'd raised some cows. Not a lot of them, but some of them, and I sold those cows to sort of help get me ready for Memphis School of Preaching, and to buy some books to get ready for the School of Preaching. And I bought several sets of commentaries, and if you know anything about raising cattle, money doesn't go far, so you didn't buy a whole lot of books, but I bought some books with the proceeds from the cows that I sold. Something that sort of gets to me, though, is that all those commentaries I bought back then, just about all of them, they're free today. They're free. They're online. Barnes, Clark, Matthew Henry, Kaufman, Colin Delitzsch, The Complete Works of Josephus. I've got that 5-volume set in my library, are free. All that money I spent, that sort of steams me. I'm glad for these folks, though, today who are in school who don't have to pay the money that we had to pay for some of those. But anyway, we don't have Josephus now in the 2nd century, and things are a bit cloudy as to what happened when and who did what, and we just do the best we can as to what we find. A third challenge for me was, what material do you include in this lecture and what material do you omit? I'm talking about 300 years of Judaism, and there are a lot of things that happen in that time frame. We have 38 to 40 minutes. I don't know why God puts it like that. We're given 38 to 40 minutes. There's no preacher on the planet going to go the short route. We're going to go the 40-minute route. So we have 40 minutes. I'll say 40 minutes to cover 300 years of Judaism, and there's no way humanly possible, obviously, to cover all of that. What do you include? What do you exclude? And you just try to do the best you can as to picking out what you deem as to be most important. A fourth challenge for me in this study was, exactly what years am I covering? You think, well, that ought to be obvious, the 2nd to the 4th centuries A.D. And without having my thinking cap on, I said, well, that's the years 200 to 400 A.D. 2nd to the 4th centuries, right, would be the years 200 to 400. Well, Cox, of course, you are wrong. The 2nd century would be the years 100 to 199. We are living in the 21st century, correct? But this is not 2118. This is 2018. So the 1st century would be 0 to 99. 2nd century, 100 to 199. So thankfully, I managed to figure out what I'm covering, the years 100 to 399 A.D., the 2nd to the 4th centuries. A fifth challenge that I'm sure that every one of the speakers on this lectureship has been confronted with: how on earth do we make this interesting? How do we do that? I know there are history teachers that just make history come alive, and you sit spellbound at their feet. I hate to tell you, I'm not one of them. So how do you make this interesting? It's 10 o'clock on Monday morning, and it's a bit tough going at Freed-Hardeman, and I'm glad to meet my good friend David Hester. We were at Freed-Hardeman together, and we took some classes together. I'm not sure if we had this class together or not, but I had a survey of civilization class at Freed-Hardeman that met at 7:30 in the morning. History class at 7:30 in the morning. I think it was Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I loved it. I loved getting up early, and I love history, but most of my classmates didn't share my enthusiasm for studying history at 7:30 in the morning. Had a class on Muslim evangelism another semester. I took it at 7:30 in the morning, and that was tough. That was some tough going there, Muslim evangelism. But anyway, we're just going to do the best we can to hit the high points and just look at this. We're going to let the centuries outline our study. The first point, as you're looking at the book, and as you know, we'll not cover everything in that book. We're going to go along with that as best we can. We're going to be looking at Judaism 2nd century, Judaism 3rd century, Judaism 4th century. Those will be our main points in the outline there. First of all, a history of Judaism in the 2nd century. That would be the years 100 to 199 A.D. You know that the letters A.D., a Latin acronym for Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord. Letters B.C. standing for those years before the birth of Christ. The letters A.D. not standing for after his death. If that were the case, there would be 33 or so years unaccounted for. The letters A.D. standing for in the year of our Lord, including the year of his birth and then subsequent years. We mark our time by his birth. But today, in scholarly circles, it is not appropriate to use the letters B.C. and A.D. anymore. Instead, there are the letters B.C.E. and C.E. Letters B.C.E. have nothing to do with Christ. They tell us they stand for not before Christ, but before the common era. Letters C.E. standing for common era. And that's the scholarly way, we're told, to reference time. And one reason, of course, for doing that is there are some folks who take offense at our BC AD time reference points. The Jews in particular, as well as those in Islam, as well as atheists, would have nothing to do with BC AD, and so references to BCE and CE. Eventually, of course, the letters BC and AD will be phased. I'm not a prophet, but eventually those letters will be phased out completely in use. We still have "In God We Trust" on our currency, don't we? Do you wonder how long? There's already a push to remove that from our currency, so who knows? Judaism, 100 to 199 AD. We know, of course, that in the first century there was a great divide between Judaism and Christianity. It became even greater of a chasm in the ensuing centuries. We want to pull out now some individuals and some happenings from this time frame that help to influence Judaism and help to, again, further the divide between Judaism and the truth. Let's talk about one Gamaliel II. Gamaliel II was the first person to lead the Sanhedrin. We might say the Sanhedrin would be the Jewish Supreme Court. He was called the Nazi, not Nazi, but the Nazi. Interestingly, this word, Hebrew term Nazi, means president. In Italian, the same transliteration, Nazi, means rice. If I were to say, let's give the Nazi, I would be saying, let's give the president rice to eat. So Nazi in Hebrew simply means president. Gamaliel II is the president of the Sanhedrin, and he wielded clout, believe you me, in that position. And he helped to strengthen the Jewish faith as none other had done in many, many years. One way he helped to do that was to put an end to the division between the two major schools of Jewish thought. You had on the one hand the school of Hillel. You had on the other hand the school of Shammai. Hillel was a Jewish sage or a wise man, and his thought was, or his way of thinking was, he was less strict, I guess is what I'm trying to say, than other schools of thought. Some would have said those who followed Hillel, if you were to tag somebody a name, they would have been the liberals. And then you have the school of Shammai, and they would have been what you might tag as the conservatives. They were much stricter than those of the house of Hillel. And so these two predominant schools of thought among the Jews, they bickered and fought and wrangled all through the years over matters that they deemed as very important. Here are three scenarios. Number one, the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel bickered over the telling of white lies. And they posed this case in point. If you tell an ugly bride she's beautiful, here's a hypothetical situation that they debated. Bride's wedding day, ugly as sin, they would say. Well, the school of Shammai said, if you tell her that she's beautiful when she's ugly, you're lying. You're lying, you have sinned. The school of Hillel said, well, if you tell an ugly bride she's beautiful on her wedding day, you're right, because aren't all brides beautiful on their wedding day? I'm sure we'd all side with the liberals on that, wouldn't we? And then the matter of divorce. Now, here's a matter more serious. The school of Shammai said, a man may divorce his wife only for a serious transgression. The school of Hillel said, a man may divorce his wife for practically any reason. If she burns supper one night, you can write a bill of divorcement the next day for any reason. Well, there we would have to agree more with the school of Shammai, especially if that one major offense was fornication. If not, we disagree with them, according to Scripture. Another thing that the school of Shammai and Hillel just wrangled over was how to light the lights in Hanukkah. Hanukkah, you recall, the Jewish festival, they celebrated that not too long ago, that commemorated the rededication of the temple that had been not destroyed, but contaminated, if you will, by those in that time frame. The Maccabees sort of cleaned that up, and so they had a festival to celebrate that. And the school of Shammai said, on the first night of Hanukkah, there are 8 nights in all, on the first night, you light all 8 candles and then decrease 1 per night. You start out with 8 and end up with 1. The school of Hillel said, no, we can't do that. On the first night of Hanukkah, you light 1 candle and then increase each successive night until you have 8 candles lit on the end. Shammai says start with 8, end with 1. Hillel says start with 1, end with 8. I wish I had that kind of time to worry about those mundane matters, don't you? What difference does it make is what we would ask. Well, that's sort of what Gamaliel said. Enough of this bickering. We have enough trouble out there as it is. We need to come together. We need to unite. And lo and behold, he did just that. He united the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. Something some would have considered impossible. He brought about unity among the Jews. If you're thinking what I'm thinking, why don't we resurrect old Gamaliel number 2 and send him to Washington, D.C. and let him sit down with the Republicans and Democrats, see if he could work some magic there. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Or would it be even greater if we could resurrect him and bring him into the church and unite some brothers who are supposed to be sound in the faith who are at each other's throats? Wouldn't that be great? If we could come together and unite, and this is something that ought to sicken us, this division that we face today. I can't keep up with who's fellowshipping whom anymore. Maybe you can. I can't keep up. And this boasting of standing for the truth is more along the lines of standing for some prominent personality who's gotten his feelings hurt. And then emails start getting sent, and social wars start, and people take sides, and lines of fellowship are drawn. I try to decide for myself, and I try to think for myself as to whom I should fellowship and whom I should not. I don't want to do anything wrong, obviously. But let's give people the benefit of a doubt until we find out otherwise for ourselves. And then address the issue. I know that I'm capable of misunderstanding a situation, and somebody else is too. But Gamaliel, give the man credit, he did have the fortitude and the know-how to unite these Jews together. This was an important aspect, obviously, in the religion of Judaism as of this time frame. You know, of course, that there were things that Gamaliel II did that weren't so good at all. He came up with a prayer, and I'm oversimplifying all this, I know, but he came up with a prayer. It had 18 parts to it, and this prayer was directed primarily against heretics and traitors. Guess who they were and are? Well, you are, and I am. We are traitors, and we're heretics to the Jews. We've abandoned the God of heaven, the one God of heaven, in accepting Christ and following Christ as the Son of God. So we are traitors, we are heretics. And so Gamaliel, this nice guy, came up with this prayer of 18 parts to the prayer directed toward God. You face Jerusalem. You didn't have to say it out loud. You could say it in your mind. But this was pleading to God against slanderers, against informers, and against traitors, again, against us. And he made this a duty to be performed 3 times a day by every Israelite. I pray to God not against my enemies. I pray to God for my enemies. There's a complete difference between praying against somebody and praying for somebody. I'm not praying for my enemies to be saved in their sins, but an open door. Jesus speaks of that, of course, in the Sermon on the Mount. I'm not going to convert somebody if my attitude is God call fire and brimstone down on their heads. And so we understand that, but Gamaliel did not. Gamaliel said, from now on, we're going to put a stop to this. We're going to put a stop to Christians coming into our synagogues. No more Christians, heretics, traitors in our synagogues. And you recall that Paul, on those missionary journeys, where did he usually go? The first place he usually went to when he went into a city? Into the synagogue. Because he knew if there were a synagogue there, he would be given an opportunity to at least speak. Well, Gamaliel said no more of that. No more Christians in the synagogues. And as we've said, he had a lot of clout and a lot of power. And if you agreed with Gamaliel, if you rubber stamped everything he said, all was well and life was good. But if you dared ever question Gamaliel, if you ever dared disagree with him, oh, you better watch out. It said that Gamaliel became so dictatorial he excommunicated his own brother-in-law. Well, the rabbi said enough's enough. They had enough of that, and so the Sanhedrin had to say, Gamaliel, you're going to have to step down. We are deposing you from your position, and they did that for a time until he regained power once again. So one individual during this time frame that really helped Judaism, but helped to further the divide between Judaism and Christianity, was Gamaliel II. I want to shift gears now and talk about the attitude during this time frame of the Jews toward the Romans. Now, as Brother Jeff pointed out last evening, Rome, that mighty military machine, just mowed down Jerusalem. And it was an awful, as he described so vividly, an awful, awful catastrophe. But that did not end the Jews by any means. And that destruction did not end Judaism by any means. Now, there's no sacrificing, obviously, as there's no temple, but that did not put it in. They're just getting warmed up in their hatred of Rome. The Jews didn't say when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, the Jews didn't say, well, let's just bury the hatchet and find some way that we can get along with these folks, these Romans. That's not their attitude at all. And so in this time frame, there were two major revolts. After that AD 70 revolt, two major revolts against Rome by the Jews. One led by Cyrenian king Lucas Andreas, and he called Jews together from Egypt and Cyprus and other areas of Mesopotamia. To a minor degree, Jews from Palestine kicked in because they're still reeling, if you recall, they're still reeling from what happened a few years earlier. But of course, in this revolt, the objective was, we're going to get the Romans out of Palestine. That's what we want to do. They're in our land. They're occupying our land. We want them out of the land. God gave us this land. It's not their land. It's our land. It's our God-given duty to drive the Romans out of the land. Well, as you know, they lost. They lost in AD 70, and now they lose under Trajan. And again, thousands of Jews died. The great synagogue of Alexandria was destroyed. And one, in describing the bloodbath at Alexandria, said, the Mediterranean Sea turned red with the blood of the Jewish victims. So many died. If you're familiar with Shiloh, the military park there in southwest Tennessee, there's a pond there at Shiloh. And it's said by historians that the water in that pond turned red from the blood of those Civil War soldiers. That may remind us of that. So this first revolt, the Jews lose again. What does that have to do with Christians? Well, see, the Jews somehow expected the Christians, whom they labeled as heretics and traitors, they expected them to help them out to fighting the Romans. And the Christians said, no, that's not how Christ taught us to live. We're to live a meek and quiet life in the world in which we live. We're not going to help you in this battle against the Romans. And so because the Christians didn't join up in this revolt or uprising, the Jews became even more angry against those who were Christians. We read of the Bar Kokhba revolt, 132 to 135 AD. Again, the second major Jewish revolt against Rome during that time frame. The Jews looked upon anybody who led an uprising against Rome, they looked upon him as a Messiah. That's what they had in mind. But when their leader died, they knew, well, we were wrong. Couldn't be the Messiah. Our Messiah's not going to die. Whenever he comes, he's not going to die. So when these fellows died, they knew they were wrong in looking upon them as Messiah. But they thought at the time that finally the Messiah has arrived in Simon Bar Kokhba. And he did some good, at least as far as Judaism is concerned. He established an independent Jewish state. He ruled over that for 3 years. Enter the Romans once again. They had enough of him. And so they defeated the Jews once again in this revolt. Heavily devastated the land of Judea. It is estimated in this revolt the Romans killed upwards of 500,000 Jews. Can you imagine burying 500,000 bodies? 500,000 bodies. That's a lot of people. They said, those Jews, those of you who are still alive, you get out of Jerusalem. You're not going to live in Jerusalem anymore. We are kicking you out of Jerusalem. And so Jewish life shifted from Judea to Galilee and beyond. The Jews were scattered. And everywhere the Jews went, anti-Semitism would follow them. This is sort of the beginning of all of that. Rome won the war, but it came at a heavy, heavy price. Now, this is the Emperor Hadrian in charge now. And usually Hadrian, when he would, in the aftermath of a war, he had to give a report to the Roman Senate. And usually Hadrian would end his report with, "All is well with me and the Roman legions. We routed those folks." But in the Bar Kokhba revolt, Hadrian, there was no tooting of his own horn when he ended that report. He didn't say, "All is well with me and the Roman legions," because though 500,000 Jews were put to death, it came at a heavy price to the Roman army. Historians have a lot of questions about this uprising. What caused it, number one, and why did Hadrian have so much trouble putting it down, number two? What was the final straw that led to this Bar Kokhba revolt? Well, number one, the Jews didn't like the Romans being in the land. We can understand that. They felt the Romans had no place there. But also, Hadrian helped to precipitate this revolt, many at least believe. Hadrian, when he came to power, he said, "You know what, we've sort of kicked these Jews long enough. So why don't we take a reverse course policy? Let's take the Jews and see if we can't treat them a little bit better. Maybe they'll act better. Maybe all this revolting will stop if we act towards them a little bit better." The Romans had the idea, we're going to let our subjects sort of run their own country as long as they pay tribute and don't cause any uprisings. We'll sort of take a back seat and let them handle their own affairs until they cause problems. And so Hadrian comes to power and he adopts this philosophy, so much so that he says, why don't we even let the Jews rebuild their temple? Why don't we do that? And Hadrian, it is said, by some at least, signed the decree. And the word went out to the Jews, we can rebuild our temple, and they were elated. Finally, things are turning in our favor. Well, the age-old nemesis, though, of the Jews came and whispered something in Hadrian's ear. The age-old nemesis being the Samaritans. Now, keep in mind, we're referencing Jewish historians here. The Samaritans may have a completely different take altogether on this, so I'm talking about Judaism here. The Samaritans whispered in Hadrian's ear, you don't need to let those Jews rebuild their temple. They're seditious people, and that'll just get them fired up even more, and there'll be more revolts, so here's what you need to do. Hadrian said, how can I not let them rebuild the temple? The edict's already gone out, and I'll lose face if I take back what I've allowed them to do. And the Samaritans said, okay, here's what you do. Let the Jews rebuild their temple, but make them choose a different site, not in Jerusalem. Or, let the Jews rebuild their temple in Jerusalem, but say, you must expand your temple by 5 cubits. Or you must shrink your temple by 5 cubits. The Samaritans telling Hadrian to tell them that because they knew the Jews would never go for that the temple had to be in Jerusalem, and the dimensions given were God-given dimensions. You could not add to nor take from or subtract from those dimensions. And so Hadrian goes to the Jews with those stipulations, and the Jews, of course, say, no, we can't, we're not going to agree to that. We want the temple built in Jerusalem on this site, those precise dimensions. And so the temple plans were dashed, and Hadrian instead built, if you're not going to build your temple, I'm going to build something there. I'll build a Roman colony there. Called it the Aelia Capitolina in 130 A.D. And you'll note, I think in the book there's some disagreement as to whether this was built before or after the revolt. But anyway, the Jews didn't like it, obviously, as this was part of this, at least gave credence to the Roman gods. A second question about this Bar Kokhba revolt. Why did Hadrian have so much trouble putting down this Jewish guerrilla warfare? It is estimated it took 250,000 Roman soldiers, 250,000 Roman soldiers, to put down this uprising. Why did Hadrian struggle so much? Historians aren't exactly sure. But it may have been, like the old saying goes, it's not the size of the dog in the fight, but what? The size of the fight in the dog. It may have been the Romans underestimated the determination and resolve of the Jews in fighting. Again, going back to the Civil War. A lot of historians think that the North underestimated the resolve of those in the South, that the war could have ended a lot earlier had the North really put its back into that war. They feel like the North fought that war with one arm behind their back for so long, and Lincoln kept dealing with McClellan and those inept generals he had, and finally Grant came along and said, if the thing is pressed, it will end, and Lincoln said, press the thing, and it ended. So that might have been why the Romans had so much trouble down this Jewish resistance. They were determined, if it cost them their lives, they were going to fight back for their land. As time has rapidly leaves other reasons for hatred, the Romans put a ban on circumcision. And remember, of course, to the Jews, now this side of the cross, circumcision is nothing, but the Jews don't accept the cross. They don't accept the New Testament. They still bind circumcision, or they did then. And if you were going to convert to Judaism, you had to be circumcised. So in banning circumcision, that banned converting people to Judaism, and their ranks thinned even more because of that ban. The Christians did not join in the Bar Kokhba revolt. The Jews became even more incensed against us who were traitors and whom they considered as heretics. Toward the middle and end of the 2nd century, the Roman emperor started lightening up on the Jews once again and repealed some of those harsh policies. And so now we come to this 3rd century AD, the years 200 and 299. And believe it or not, the unthinkable started happening. The mighty Roman Empire began showing some cracks. Barbarian invasions, civil war, general social breakdown. But for the most part, ironically, while Rome is floundering, Judaism is flourishing. It is estimated upwards of 3 million Jews in existence as of this time frame. Concentrations just about everywhere. A major achievement during this time period, the compilation and editing of the Mishnah, the oral law handed down. They wanted a record of that oral law, to have sort of a permanent record of that. The oral law being a commentary on the written law. Whenever I read a commentary, I know that I'm just reading a book about the Bible that may or may not be accurate. But the Jews, whenever they read the rabbi's commentary, they took it to a much higher level than just a commentary as we would look upon it. So the Mishnah, and you have some of the information about that on there. Romans, again, give the Jews more freedom during this time period. And then the last part, the 4th century, 300 to 399 AD, there's a whole lecture on the conversion of Constantine, and that looks really great and thorough. I've read parts of that, and so we're not going to talk about that other than to say here that Constantine's, quote, adopting Christianity was a foreboding thing, of course, to Jews. You would want your Roman emperor really to take a hands-off policy toward religion, but you would want him adopting your religion, Judaism, rather than Christianity, if that were the case. Finally, a fellow by the name of Julian came to the Roman throne. It is said that Julian was the most favorable emperor that the Jews ever had. Julian, sort of sounds like Jew, right? Julian, Jew. And Julian said, I'm not just going to let the Jews rebuild the temple. I am ordering the temple to be rebuilt in Jerusalem. And again, the Jews are elated. The reason that Julian wanted the temple built stone upon stone was to make Jesus Christ a liar. That's why he wanted the temple built, to falsify the very words of Jesus. And just one little thing got in the way of Julian rebuilding that temple and making the Lord out to be a liar. Just one little thing, a little thing called death. He died, and you want to think that God's providence had a hand in old Julian's death. We are, I suppose, out of time, and I'm sorry for that. Just a few points of application as to what we've talked about, and we can't cover all of that. It doesn't matter what history says and who's on the throne. The prime reason for the rift between Judaism and Christianity is their rejection of Jesus as the Messiah. Do we have common ground with the Jews? Indeed we do. Monotheism. We believe in one God as they. For the most part, the Jews are moral people, and we are to be moral people too. They believe in life after death. We believe in life after death. But all that common ground cannot make up for the fact that there is a rejection of Jesus, and if you reject Jesus, as Jesus himself said to Jews then and now, you die in your sins. John 8 in verse 24. Zeal is a wonderful thing, and don't doubt for a moment the zeal of the Jews. They lost in AD 70. They lost under Trajan. They lost under Hadrian. Look at what Hitler did to the Jews in World War II, and yet look at their perseverance. You don't doubt for one moment their zeal and their belief in their religion. But as Paul said then, Paul would say today, that it's zeal without knowledge. Romans 10, again in verse 2. Freedom is precious. We never want to take our freedom for granted, and especially freedom that we have in Christ. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. John 8:32. We can be a law-abiding citizen, and we can be a Christian at the very same time. Paul is a case in point. Paul lived in the Roman Empire. He lived under some oppressive Roman rulers, but he remained a child of God. If we have a problem with the government in which we live, and we do, we don't pick up stones. We don't make bombs. We don't kill people. We address those matters in a civil way at the voting booth if you choose to vote, and certainly in prayer to God. We can be a Christian in spite of who's on the throne or who's in the White House. We can be a Christian nonetheless. War is awful and war is evil. I know in the Old Testament God commanded the Jews to war, and anything that God commands is right. He is preserving his people. The folks in the New Testament, we serve a different, or we war rather, a warfare of a different kind, not with bombs and bullets, but with the sword of the Spirit and with the gospel. I know that Hollywood glamorizes war and video games trivialize war, but for those who've been there and done that, and I haven't been, my dad has, and he and others will tell you there's nothing glamorous about taking somebody's life. Even if they're trying to kill you, it's not a pleasant thing. Fixing a bayonet at the end of a rifle and running 2 Koreans through with that face to face is a sight and an action that you never ever forget. Nothing glamorous about that. Has to be done on occasion, we know that, but nothing glamorous about that. Prejudice remains a sin. The Jews didn't like the Samaritans for the simple fact they were Samaritans. The Samaritans didn't like the Jews for the same reason, Gentiles as well. And if I prejudge somebody based on where he lives, or what he looks like, or the color of his skin, or how much money he has or doesn't have, if I prejudge somebody based on those things, it is shameful. It is, forgive the uncouthness of this, it is stupidity, and more than that, it is sin. It is absolute sin. There's no respect to persons with God, and if I'm a God-fearing person, there best be no respect to persons with me either. Thank you very much.